Okay, this is Paul Rabideau, and this is session 9, and we're continuing to discuss anxiety, and then we're going to pay a lot of attention to what the Apostle Paul said as a way of treating anxiety. Is we're going to pay attention, and we're going to look carefully at gratitude. And I realize I'm going to need to speed up a little bit if we're going to get to everything I brought with me these weeks. But I want to look at Jesus and his emotional intelligence when it comes to, or just to learn from, and in this case, look at Gethsemane, what was going on in Gethsemane, where Jesus displays lots of distress. It's not the only place he displayed distress. So let me read this. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Okay. So just think about what's happening here. He's anticipating his arrest, right? The disciples will fall away, all of them, not just Peter, right? And also anticipating his suffering, okay, which is going to happen very soon, right, within the next day. And he's praying earnestly, "Remove this cup from me," right? Like it says he's falling on his face. So our bodies are doing things. He's falling on his face. And that's just part of the emotion, I think. He wakes and speaks to his disciples in the way that he did, and Jesus asks a second time and a third time, right? And then he rouses everybody, and he goes to meet his betrayer, okay? Starting that process of going to the cross. And he's been talking about going to the cross for quite a while now, for weeks now, as they've been making their way to Jerusalem. So what was Jesus feeling? Okay, so you could look at this passage and treat it, say, well, what were the feeling words? Maybe what other words reveal emotion that he's experiencing, and what am I experiencing as I read this passage? Right? You could use this passage, I think. So what was Jesus feeling? So we just look at some of the words, right? Sorrow. So Jesus was feeling sorrow even to death, like a sorrow even to death, right? I say the word sorrow. I mean, I can feel something. I don't know, not entirely unpleasant, but I don't know, it feels like something is building here, right? Sorrow, right? Even to death. Troubled, distressed, he's in agony, he's profusely sweating, like as if like drops of blood. That's what his sweat is like. So this is what Jesus is experiencing: distress. And is he experiencing some fear and desperation? But he's still determined to obey his Father, right? He stays on track. Is there another way? And we're going to talk about knowing God's will, and this is a really important phrase, or watching what happens here with Jesus, but not my will or your will. He also has this determination, I think, in the midst, this sorrow, just genuine distress and agony, but also this determination. Is he irritated? So I'm asking questions too. The first set, this is what is happening. And now taking some guesses. Is he irritated with the disciples or disappointed or hurt? Or is it a concern for them? This is amazing that Jesus, we see examples going forward here to the cross, how he shows concern for others while he is going to the cross. Like, how does he do that? That's tremendous emotional intelligence, I think. So we'll look at that at some point. So, what is happening and what is Jesus feeling? And we have to take some guesses, but we don't have to guess about some of these incredible sorrow and distress. And I think you see a growing acceptance, and then at the end, let's go, and a resolve at the end. So Jesus kind of starting with this distress, and then working his way through it, and as he, what was he thinking? He prayed once, he prayed twice, he prayed 3 times, and then I think he's coming to a conclusion. This is what I have to do, and his determination and focus growing, and I think the distress and sorrow not completely disappearing maybe, or maybe some hurt or disappointment, but come on, let's go, and we go. And you see what he does when he meets his betrayer and the soldiers and is arrested. He's very purposeful, right? And he remains focused on other people during this time. We will talk about that another time. So I think if we think about this in an emotional intelligence framework, and what he genuinely feels, and awareness of this, but his mind has remained engaged, and his thinking, he's purposeful, and he's still able to think. He is able to think still at this point. And the disciples are checking out to the point of sleep. They can't even think about this, right? But Jesus is able to think and regulate himself as he prayed once, prayed twice, prayed 3 times. Okay, let's go, right? That's amazing. I would like to be more like that. Okay. I'm going to skip these next 2 slides, but it's just practical things you might do for yourself to help cope with stress, which might very well be, I'm not going to listen to the news for a little while, or something like that, right? And taking care of yourself and so forth. These slides are in the deck. And then also, what about children? How do they express stress? It'll be different because they don't have the words like adults might, right? But I want to give Steve a chance to just talk about medications and more about the physiology and the neuroscience of stress. Okay? And these are some of the things he's going to say. I'll never remember, but I will remember I heard them, and have confidence in like the overall story about stress. And, yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for this excellent presentation. And what I want to do for a moment is just sort of paint for you a little bit of the neuroscience involved, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the neurotransmitters and the medications. Okay. Now, we actually have a retired pharmacist here, so he would definitely be an expert in this field. Now, what you have to know is a couple of basics of cellular and physiology, okay? And some of that cellular physiology is the following. Think of a neuron as a long string with a little bulb on the end. And that little bulb or little balloon has got little vacuum packs of what they call neurotransmitters. And they are stored in these little vacuum-like things. And when the impulse comes down, the electricity comes down the neuron, gets to the end, and it causes that little vacuum, little bubble to be absorbed into the cell wall of the neuron, and its contents gets released into this little tiny space called the synapse. And that little neurotransmitter, that protein that's released into the sort of ocean or the synapse, it floats across to the next neuron, to the next nerve in the body. And that next nerve has a docking site, a place where this neurotransmitter that was released from the previous one floats across and sort of kind of like one of those Star Wars things where the ship, the little tiny vessel docks into the big mothership. That's what's happening. Now, what medicines do is it affects 2 or 3 or 4 of critical phases of this transmission. Medicines can cause you to release more neurotransmitter, or it can inhibit the release of the neurotransmitter. In that little space where we call the synapse, where the neurotransmitter is kind of free, you can use medications to destroy the neurotransmitter faster than it's released. So that's called inhibition. So if you release a neurotransmitter, we'll say epinephrine, and you have a drug that destroys it, well, and it's not going to have a chance to transmit the next message, is it? So you can slow things down. Then you go to the other side of the little valley there called the next neuron, and where you have the docking site, we call it the receptor site. What you can do is you can manipulate that. You can take a drug and attach it to the receptor site faster than the neurotransmitter and stimulate the nerve. And then you can make it so that it doesn't leave the neurotransmitter, it continues to stimulate the next nerve. Or you can take a drug and you can block it. The neurotransmitter that's native can't dock at all. So if you manipulate several of those things, now you get medications that we use. Okay? So let's just talk about one. So that would be the anti-anxiolytics, and the one that's been around forever would be like lorazepam, Valium. People understand that one. So it works on the gamma-butyric pathway, amino acid pathway. And so what it does, we use a mnemonic GABA, and it is a neurotransmitter. It's a protein that's released. And what it does, when it travels across the little synapse and attaches to the neuron, it actually inhibits nerve impulses from going forward. It slows down neuron transmission. Okay, does that make sense? Now, if that happens, in a state where you're hyperactive, anxious thoughts, your mind is racing, what you do is you take the medication and it will block the extra GABA neurotransmitter, it actually stimulates the receptor so that the body thinks there's more GABA neurotransmitter, which when it does its job, it slows things down. So you're actually increasing, in effect, the effectiveness of the neurotransmitter. So that's what anti-anxiolytics do. So if you increase the GABA thing or its effect, you then also, because its effect is a slowing down effect, you slow down that neuronal transmission of information and you relax. Your thoughts aren't racing. Now, clinically, this happens quite a bit. I've had many patients come in and they say, I'm just so anxious, and they described all the symptoms you described. Their heart's racing, they're flushed, their chest hurts, and usually they say, and this is how I feel when I have my panic attack, all right? I give them one shot. It's Ativan, lorazepam, boom. And like an hour later, they're a totally different person. And all that is generally true unless you have something else causing the problem. which really can happen. So I had one lady come in one time, and she was anxious, and she literally was on the bed going like this. I am so anxious. I'm so anxious. I feel like I'm crawling out of my skin. I thought she was nuts. So I go back and I write, we should just check a thyroid hormone, because thyroid hormone right here regulates your body's metabolism. So if you have a lot of thyroid hormone, it means that you're on hyperdrive. You're moving, you've got energy. In fact, we used to use it to help lose weight. We don't use that anymore because it causes other things. But it just gives you lots of metabolism. So I checked it. I checked the level. I got a call from the lab an hour later, and they were all in a panic. It is so high, Dr. Price, we have to dilute it 4 times. So she was hyperthyroid, which would make her extremely anxious. So I did not need to give her anti-anxiolytics. She had another reason why she was feeling that way. So I use this as an illustration to show that there are the emotional and the physiologic side of things are very interrelated, but you also have to recognize that there are disease processes that present with the same sort of somatic symptoms. And so this is why we think it's good to work together so that we can manage that. Okay, so back to the medicines. So the medicines do that. Now there's another class out there. They're called the serotonin drugs, the SSRIs. You might know them like Paxil or something like that. And so those drugs, serotonin is, when you have serotonin, it sort of makes you feel good. It's like a dopamine drug, makes you feel better. So we'll try to use those medications, manipulate that to increase your mood, right? And dopamine, that big area, so the dopamine drugs that we use the serotonin drugs we use sort of like for depression and anxiety. But then there's a third class, the dopamine drugs, the things that affect the dopamine neurotransmitter, which is sort of a precursor to epinephrine. We use medicines there that help impact the area of schizophrenia, where there's clearly a lot of unusual neuronal activity. So that's kind of how you think about it. Now, you think, okay, these drugs are great, so I can treat this, and I can at least feel better. The idea is calm down enough so you can now use your thinking rationally, right? When you're, for example, anxiety, your mind is racing so bad, you can't even put 2 thoughts together and figure out, there's no logic, there's no mathematical skill, so you slow it down so we can now deal with it and work at it logically. But at the same time, if you take too much of these drugs, it can cause adverse effects. And so, for example, there's a syndrome called serotonin syndrome, where you take too many of the SSRIs, the inhibitors, and what happens is you actually can die from that. There are some cases in the literature about that. So there's a fine balance with these medications. Some is good, too much is bad, because the body isn't designed to have too much of that neurotransmitter. So I'm trying to keep it relatively simple, but if you can think of the the anatomy and the physiology, then it makes sense what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do that. All right? Is that
Super.
okay?
Super.
Yes.
When you say too much is bad, do you mean too big of a dose or for using it for too long?
Yes and yes. Okay. So toxicity is not just an immediate, I took too much as an overdose and suicide, causing an acute serotonin syndrome, for example. But you can take things over time that can cause what we just chronic effects. And so those are more subtle to recognize those as toxicities. So that's a very good question. But you have to, that's why we usually, when we start them, we kind of monitor them for a bit of time so that we make sure we're not past the therapeutic window, which is what makes the psychology world and the medical world have to work together. In fact, we had a long talk about that last night, about how we can better work together so that we're not hurting someone by too much or too little medication. So that's a very good question. All right.
Yeah.
Everything?
Super.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's what I'll take away from all that information is The chemicals and the electrical signals as described there are all things happen in my body and in my mind. I have thoughts, right? But if something is dysfunctioning like that, in one way or another, why? And it's preventing me from being able to talk or even read my Bible or understand that verse or believe that verse, why not try to deal with the dysfunction medically and so that the client can talk? And it happens frequently with me, and I have a situation right now that pretty much every week when I'm talking to this person, it's trying to convince them, take the medication you were given, right? Because our conversations are only somewhat helpful. And the next week we come back, how are you doing? And it's exactly the same thing. Nothing has changed. Take the medication, right? And what will happen is she'll then be able to talk. And I've seen it many times, anxiety and depression. Right? So why not? Why not deal with the dysfunction? And it could be bodily, more bodily or more up here in the skull or that part of the body or this part of the body, right? It's all the body. So, so let's talk about gratitude, and I'm going to move pretty quickly. We've sort of alluded to a lot of this already. Developing an attitude of gratitude, okay? Give thanks always for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Give thanks always for everything, okay? That's a pretty big statement. Give thanks always for everything. I guess I got to keep that in mind because some of that everything is going to happen today, and give thanks always for everything. This is even more powerful, I think. Give thanks in all circumstances. Okay, you've heard this. Not for everything, not for all the circumstances, the things that happen to me, but give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. It is the will of God. What's the will of God for my life? Well, let's start here. This is the will of God for you, that we develop the ability, the habit to give thanks in all the circumstances that happen to me. That is how important gratitude is in the Christian life, is that it's the will of God for us to be grateful people. Whatever you do, so these are pretty big words, whatever, right? Everything, all, whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him, right? So there is an imperative for us to learn to be grateful. And we saw from Philippians 4, it's protective. It's heart and mind protective for us. It brings a life of peace, and in particular, it's an antidote for anxiety, right? Okay, have you convinced you that we want to work on our gratitude, right? And then show that to other people. Ingratitude is unhealthy. More stress, more cholesterol, cortisol, higher blood pressure, higher blood sugar, impaired immune system, the cholesterol, the diabetes, the heart disease, the stroke, the obesity. Ingratitude causes that. Right? Okay, and we do a lot to try to keep these things from happening to us and to deal with them when we have them. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God, nor give thanks to him. It's interesting that that's called out. Right? But they became futile in their thinking rather than grateful, and their foolish hearts, which I think ungodly hearts, were darkened. There's the futile, foolish mind versus the thankful mind. And for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, the whole list. And in the middle of this list, ungrateful. Put ungrateful with brutal and treacherous and reckless, and they're ungrateful. Avoid such people. Right? That's a powerful statement. Do not hang out with people who are ungrateful, and these other types of things. And because that will affect us. A complaining, ungrateful person, that affects our mood. And we become like the people we hang out with. So this is, gratitude is so important in the Christian life, and we want to protect it. Okay? Grateful people are happier, healthier in every possible way, physically, emotionally, psychologically. We're more I like this. When we are more grateful, we are more energetic. We're less materialistic. We have better marriages and relationships in general, and we don't get upset by circumstances as easily, right? Because we are thankful in all circumstances. We think right now, what's good and what can I be grateful for? And that helps me deal with circumstances. So let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. I mean, it'd be good if more of our talking to God was about gratitude. That would be also, that's a good exercise for us. And I just remind you that there is, that there were, in Israel's history, there were activities that were built into the calendar and into life about Levites giving praise to God and being thankful. And so God knew this needs to be built into the lives of my people, right? Okay. Any final thoughts about anxiety or gratitude? So.
Yeah. One thought, it was in the reference of Romans chapter 1, verse 21, and it said they did not acknowledge God nor give thanks. That one?
Yeah.
And I would be interested in your thought on this. I totally agree with your comments on gratefulness or gratitude. But it occurred to me in previous study that one of the things that's inherent in gratitude is actually a sort of acknowledgement of the rightful place of God. In that text, we did not acknowledge God, nor were we thankful. It's almost as to they're juxtaposed. And it made me wonder if, in the process of gratitude, which you've outlined very well, does it also set our heart to the right perspective of the authority and governorship of God? And that in and of itself has a way of bringing peace to a soul, kind of the sovereignty statements you made earlier. And I'd be interested in what you thought about that line of thinking.
Yeah. So does our knowledge of God and knowing him as he really is in his place as sovereign and our King and our Savior, that knowledge, can that be employed and should that be employed in this area of gratitude and thankfulness? And I think that makes sense. I mean, because gratitude has to be about a thought about something that's true. And anxiety is very often about a lack of control and uncertainty, and I think that relates to a lack of control. So I feel out of control, and maybe because there's uncertainty or other reasons, maybe because of the way I feel, health-wise or something like that. But coming back to knowing God, who he is, and his loving and powerful and sovereign nature, I guess his place in the universe, that should be comforting. I guess if I'm on his side, that should be comforting. When I became a Christian in college, 46 years ago, I had this strong sense of God in his heaven and as judge, and me as a sinner, and not connected to him, I realize maybe for the first time in my life that, wait a minute, I am on the wrong side of this. Okay? So that's, let's say if that's the thought, what would the emotion likely be? Fear. I was terrified. I remember laying in bed thinking, if he shows up right here, I'm just going to dissolve. Right? And I don't think you can stay in that state very long. You can't stay like that. So I think you have to either decide God is not in his heaven. None of that's true, right? Or you have to move to his side, right? And I went through a phase of wanting to just give it all, just throw it all away, but I moved to his side, right? So now when I think of God in his heaven, powerful and loving and sovereign, and all the goodness of him and that I've experienced, it now creates a different emotion, right? And that emotion is peace, and maybe also joy, because I'm thinking about God, and the way to get more joy, that's just giving something away early here, and the way to get more peace is to think about God, the most joyful person in the universe and the most peaceful person, and to have my thoughts on him. So it depends what that means to me. What does it mean that God is in his place there? What does it mean to me? It could mean I'm dead, or it could mean I'm alive, and then it will create the appropriate emotion, right? So if I'm experiencing an emotion I don't like, I could go back and say, well, what is causing this? Do I not trust God? I mean, I know he's in his heaven and he's sovereign, but I'm anxious, right? So those are incongruent, right? Incongruent thoughts. So what else is going on here? Maybe I don't really trust him. I mean, I know he's there, I believe he's there, but I don't trust him. What's making me not trust him? And maybe I can uncover that. I had a upbringing of insecurity or uncertainty, and that's what I'm believing in, that is going to drive my life. Is it true? Is it true? And then I can realize, no, he has control. And now I change my thought, and it brings with it a congruent emotion of security and peace and maybe joy, right? So I think that's how this works, or that's how it could work for us. And when we do that, we become more Christ-like. So aware of what am I thinking and what am I feeling, and if it doesn't seem godly, then what's going on with that? And if I can diagnose that and then change my thought, write down the thought, as I did in my chart and my worksheet, and is that thought true? And then change it to make it true. Think on those things that are true. And I might need to practice this, because negative thoughts do not give up easily. And whether it's a little demon throwing these fiery darts at me, these negative thoughts, or it's my own mind and I'm completely capable of producing them myself, in understanding, what is true, and then getting it on the side of truth, and then that will change my feelings. Even if what is true is, I did the wrong thing there, and I feel appropriately guilty, well, I can do something about that. Right? So we'll stop here for today, and we'll start covering emotions, both positive and negative, one after another over the next several days, and then we'll do some other things as well. Okay, thank you.